Welcome to the LBJ PhD Colloquium, where Dr. Kristen Gwinn-Becker has been kind enough to join us today. Dr. Gwinn-Becker received a PhD in history from George Washington University in 2008. She published work on progressive reformers Jane Addams and Emily Green Balch while working at the University of Chicago Press, and then founded HistoryIT in 2011. Dr. Gwinn-Becker, or you've asked me to call you Kristen, thank you so much for coming. Maybe we can start by, maybe you can talk about HistoryIT today, and then we'll go back into the history of the organization and your personal history. What is the mission of HistoryIT?
To save history. It's simple, right?
To save history.
So the mission is, well, to save history because we believe it is in danger in two central ways. It's in danger of disappearing. So disappearing both physically, if we do not transfer it to the digital world in the correct way. A lot of organizations digitize their holdings, but not in a way that is that meets some level of digital preservation, which I could go on ad nauseum if you wish. And then, so that we're creating file formats that are going to become obsolete, for example. And we've been complaining about this for the last 20 years. How are we going to, deal with all this born digital material? Well, a lot of what organizations are doing is taking, creating PDFs, creating JPEGs. The web isn't always going to render these file formats. So there has to be a thoughtful plan in place on how to digitize. The other, which is a little more difficult to pinpoint because it varies so much, but it's in danger of disappearing because even if it's digital, so it's perfectly digitally preserved, it's in the right file format, it's at an institution that has, the funds and resources to sustain it. If nobody finds it, it doesn't exist, right? So mainly, the idea of saving history is first, anything that's in its physical form needs to be digital in a very specific way. If it doesn't get there, then then we haven't saved it. Okay, now it's there. Now it has to be tagged, and it has to be tagged in such a way that the people who would draw meaning and value from it can find it. And for me, that's everyone, because I think that a lot of this is something I'm sure I'll go into more detail on in a bit, but a lot of the ways in which materials are currently cataloged, they're an analog cataloging in a digital world, which means that even if we get there and they're cataloged to a certain extent, only professional researchers will be able to access them. And that's important, and that's more than where we are now. But people are no longer okay with only receiving curated content for them. Access to the primary sources is what allows people to form their own opinions and judge, their validity of any conclusions. So without those materials being fully accessible now in the way that people expect them to be, because they expect that everything is on Google, whatever that means. So that's save history is our mission. That's easier to say than that very long elevator pitch.
So maybe you could go into a little more detail about what conventional historical research looks like. What's the technology of conventional historical research? What do you think the potential is? And then what's a kind of a middle ground that's achieved by people who go by organizations that go part of the way toward what you consider to be best practice?
Conventional historical research, it looks like what I'm sure you are all familiar with. There is a physical collection somewhere that has been deemed important by people who are important. In order to access that physical collection, you need to have the right credentials, first and foremost. Well, let's back up from there. You need to have the time to do it. You need to have the training to do it. And you need to have the right credentials. You need to hope that someone is there to unlock the door to let you in to vet your credentials. So there are all of these obstacles before you even see something that is historical, right? Before you can even access this archival information. Now, the training then becomes the key part. So great. So what if we accept the viewpoint that many people have, that is, this is the way it's always been done. I do not accept this, by the way. This is the way it's always been done. As long as it's physically preserved here, researchers will always exist. People will always have the drive and determination to find it. Yes, that is true. But sorry, lost my train of thought there for a minute. But now, once you get into the archive, you need some sort of way to navigate it, right? And so we, as researchers, we're trained in exactly how to do this. What questions do you ask? We are now, in a Google culture, we have been trained to ask a question, get an answer, or don't get an answer. And when you watch people who do have a background in some level of research or critical thinking, even, there's maybe I asked the wrong question. Maybe that's not the word I should use. But for the most part, well, it just doesn't exist. Hey, look, slavery never happened. Not according to the words that I'm choosing to put into a search engine. So that traditional, conventional way, dominates all, 99.999% of historical research now. What we have started to see in the last 20, 25 years, is this painful move. I know, in academia, we move slowly, is a kind word, I think, for it in terms of change. And so the idea that materials need to be digital is something that's okay. I mean, I don't think you'd find many people who manage professional archives who would declare that digitization is not important, although I have met many people who have. I have met people who believe that the internet is a fad. This is actually where the danger is. I think there's a danger then in an organization saying, oh, we have to be digital, or our board told us we need to be digital, or someone somewhere said that we have to be digital. So we're going to go and be digital. We don't know what that means. So that's when it gets messy, because what it really means to be digital is a very involved process. So if you understand what it involves, it's too big and scary to think about, and you sure can't explain it to your board, because they think you get an intern and a scanner and you are fully accessible. And the smallest project we work on requires about 40,000 hours. I mean, that's one hell of an intern. So that's and as you've seen, anything that's online, yes, does it further our ability to find it? Yes. But then are we getting into this, like, we say that we're saving history because what goes digital now, what is available in some sort of way, that's going to be the most accessed material. So that in and of itself, as we know, is going to shape the conclusions of the people who are researching it. Did that answer your question, or?
I think so, yeah. I wanted to ask what's wrong with PDF and Jpeg, and how do you like to do digitization?
So a couple things. First is the file format. Mm-hmm. So a PDF, what is it called? Portable document file, something like that. A Jpeg, a PNG. These are all what are called tend to be low resolution. Yes, you can have high resolution versions of some of these, but for our purposes, they are considered low resolution. So let's just talk about paper. We're only talking about paper now. That'll be easier. So they're scanned in at a certain resolution. People talk about DPI, and that can be higher or lower, right? But if you're scanning to one of those file types, you are by default, you're scanning at a lower resolution. Now, what happens as technology develops, right now, we view images and documents online many times in the format of a JPEG file or a PDF file. formats will change, and a JPEG is going to be like a zip drive. If any, am I dating myself now? We get, or this just came across my desk this morning. Here's your PDF. Good luck using it. I'm sorry, did you just spend 20 grand to digitize all your publications to PDF? Have fun. So that first and foremost is then there's the access to it. So just because it's digital, there's what we call at HistoryIT, we call it the digital dumping ground. It's digital, it's out there. So it's good. It's not tagged, it's not in a system, it's not accessible in any real way. Then it's kind of the same as someone just opening the door to the archive without a finding aid, and you can just start to meander.
Yeah. How do you avoid obsolescence? It seems like every file format has the possibility of change. I mean, the media that we have seem to change more quickly, but the file formats change over time as well. There must be documents from the Clinton administration that are in WordPerfect files.
Oh yes,
yeah.
Oh yes, we see a lot of WordPerfect. So in terms of, I'm not going to talk about the born digital materials, like things that were written in as a Word doc or WordPerfect doc or anything, but just to talk about the creation of a digital file from a physical file. So there's an international standard that exists for imaging material, and it's 6,000 pixels along the shortest edge, longest edge. Remember that, but they don't let me in the imaging lab. And it's with current technology, it gets us as close to the original artifact as one can get. It produces a very large TIFF file. And this TIFF file, say it's 60 gigs. That's your archival master, and that lives in a digital archive. Then there are web derivative files. So then from that, you create a JPEG, you create a PDF, you create a baked potato, whatever they're going to call the next thing, you create that. And then all of a sudden, we wake up and the web doesn't render JPEGs. We're not out of luck. We can go back to that archival master and produce the new file format in as high a quality as we can.
That makes a lot of sense. But let's get back to your personal biography. So why did you found HistoryIT? What happened to you between 2008 and 2011, or maybe it started earlier, that made you think you wanted to go down this road instead of a more the road that other PhDs in history go down?
I was bored, really. When I went to do my PhD, I specifically, when I started my program, I did not have a great interest in teaching. I really didn't. I spent a few years as a TA, and that definitely confirmed that I didn't want to do that. So, but I went to GW because I got a research fellowship to work at the Eleanor Roosevelt papers. So that paid my way through my PhD school, and that was great. I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. I was just, 24 and arrogant, and I wanted a PhD. And I wanted to be a graduate student to just have, years of playing in archives. So I didn't have what I think a lot of people have with this kind of alt-ac, whatever term people are using now. I didn't have that kind of crisis because I didn't have a great passion to be a college professor. I didn't have that. So, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do with it. So before I went back to school to do my PhD, I was a software developer for what that was in the late 90s. I moved to San Francisco for the .com boom, for the bust, all of that. So, I couldn't code my way out of a paper bag now, but I was thinking, I can think from a technologist perspective or from a software developer's perspective. So I was living in Chicago. I was working at the University of Chicago Press because I thought, well, it's kind of an interesting transition between academia and maybe, I'll just work in academic publishing for a bit and see what that's like. hey, 2007, 2008, 2009, great time to be on the job market, really great time to be in academic publishing. So there were a lot of things going on. While I was finding myself, I got a few gigs here and there and increasingly more gigs with, so colleagues that I had with the humanities background, they got a grant to do something digital. They used that grant, they hired a firm, they got a result that they could not use over and over and over again. Why? Well, because when someone in the humanities describes something, someone in technology hears that, but those words mean very different things. So it wasn't necessarily that, necessarily that the company was screwing over the grant recipient. It was that they didn't really understand its purpose, and they were quite literally taking some requirements and wouldn't think, well, what about this kind of user? What about sustainability? And on the humanities side, we're not trained to think about any of those things. It's just kind of magic. So somebody, well, now this doesn't work. Can you fix it? So I fixed a ton of these things. And I was overseeing technology at the Journals Press at the time. And so we had consultants come in all the time, most of whom were very stupid. That's a kind word for what they were. And they own their own businesses. And I don't have a background in business. I have no idea really what's involved. But if that moron can have a successful business enough to come in here and pitch me, I bet I can do this. So I left the press and I founded HistoryIT in February 2011. We just celebrated 10 years. And then really kind of the wild adventure began.
I guess we're going to go back and forth between your biography and what the potential for digital history.
Sure.
Maybe we should stick with the biography for a little bit. So what are some of the challenges that you've encountered in making this happen? What did you expect to be hard or easy? And what have been some of the surprises?
How long do you have? Wow. I mean, the learning curve is monumental. From business best practices to finance, to legal, to HR, across the board. And I learned early on, thankfully, that relying on mentors, as with pretty much everything, is a key to success. I learned, I was giving a talk recently, I learned where not to skimp if I was to do it over again. Mistakes that cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars years later, because I didn't really understand the legal setup of a company, or so there were a lot of just kind of logistical hurdles. Being I didn't know what I was doing. I thought you have a lot of smart people and we're going to make smart things happen, but I didn't have management skills. I think people. Interacting with people, managing people, those are their own sets of skills that I didn't have a background in. And so that became kind of very quickly kind of scaling up what positions to hire when. Those sorts of decisions around growth, those have been the most challenging. That's on the personal side. On the kind of company side, it was so hard. It still is hard 10 years ago, is that we're educating our market. We're not out there selling widgets and we just have to explain why this widget's better than that one because I have a PhD, so my widget's better. We have to explain to people, in detail that they actually don't really want. But I hope that you all take, the information about JPEGs and PDFs and master TIFF files to a bar. If you can go to a bar again anytime, and impress people with it. People don't really want to know that, but it's very difficult to explain what's involved. So education is even more so as leadership is changing within a lot of organizations. Those arguments are not as onerous to go through, but it is still, how people, most people don't see the difference between us and an intern and a scanner except money.
So given that illusion, what is HistoryIT's business model? How do you sustain your work, and how has that changed over time?
We started just with the services side of what we still do. So when I started, I wanted to, I'd spent time in hundreds and hundreds of archives, and I saw content. I didn't see, just these resources for, me, the historian, to get to play with. I saw content, unique content. This is, content is king, whatever you can put out there. Every organization has this rich amount of unique content, but they think about archives as the world of the researcher, right? So I started with wanting to help organizations of all kinds, just, better utilize their history, just better utilize it. Just on that, I don't really know what that was, but I did that for a little bit, but quickly realized within the first year that the software was a major issue, that the vast majority of, certainly of affordable software out there, was what I call an analog practice, trying to just move into a digital realm. It wasn't created thinking about the digital experience, how people interact on the web, how people ask questions, what their research model looks like, how that's different. Instead, it takes the experience of going into, it's a card catalog, right? It's a card catalog. And so you need to actually have had that experience and realize that that's what you're trying to do over here. And in a lot of ways, even if an organization wanted to really utilize tags, which is kind of the main part of how we do what we do, the software wouldn't let them. The software was just, confining us to a very certain model. So we built our own software platform. Our first one in 2013. We're launching the new and completely rebranded one in June. Our third one, built to really handle this, to help people organize their archival materials in a way that could produce the kinds of results that we want to create. So our business model is now software and services. The services side of what we do is, I say digital history, soup to nuts. So every single project we do begins, oh, hold on. I run a technology company, but lights befuddle me.
We can see you either way.
Oh, okay. I'll stand in the dark. It's the motion sensor. I just need to move more. So we start every single project with a strategic plan, because every project that's happened has been shelved somewhere along the line. Something's happened. So we need to come in and figure out what you have, what it looks like, what its condition is, what you've done, really just get a state of the archive or the collections or whatever it is you have, physical, digital, all of it. And then interview stakeholders across an organization, not just the librarians and archivists and maybe curators on staff, everyone, so that we can start to think about, okay, how is this content in your archive? How is it being available in the digital realm, helping support other initiatives? Because frankly, if we don't do that, no one's ever going to fund it. They're just going to see it as, well, that's this special place for special researchers and they can come and deal with it. When you start to show them, actually, what if you could keyword search absolutely anything you want and find this? How does that change your job? How does that change your end user's experience, whatever it is?
And how does that change who your end users are?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think about some of these questions, I mean, if you look at, history generates its share of bestsellers, because even today people are really interested in, what Lyndon Johnson's true views on race were.
Yes.
And, but it's difficult for an amateur to get any kind of independent perspective on that, given the way the archives are organized and how limited access is. So it sounds to me like you have the mission of HistoryIT. There are several benefits to really making archives digitally searchable. One is democratization, so it opens up the research process to non-specialists, which is a double-edged sword, right? People can say crazy things, but it also
They will anyway.
it gets more people engaged with the subject matter. It increases the transparency of the research process. If you can, explain, if you can explain how exactly you found the documents and how you chose to interpret them, that's potentially something that somebody else could do. And that's the third thing, is it increases the replicability of research. So this is the question that I really wanted to ask you, and then maybe we can open up the floor very soon. There's a replication crisis in many fields of research, psychology, preclinical biomedicine, clinical trials, education. When people go back and try to replicate classic results that are widely cited and appeared in top journals, in most fields, at least half the time, the researchers are unable to replicate those results using new patients, new subjects, new data. And one reason for that is that there's this kind of idea that this very special expert did this thing sort of off in a corner somewhere with some data and software that only they had access to, and now they're going to tell you the truth. And there are really benefits for bringing as much of that out in the open as possible, and walking readers through the process of how you arrived at the results so that they can replicate it and test the sensitivity to various approaches. History hasn't really, the question of replicability in history hasn't received the same attention in recent years, but it's clearly an issue. So Jeremy Surrey, who's not here, he talks about going into archives that other historians have been in and looking in the footnotes of somebody else's book and saying, oh, okay, well, this should be in this box here on page 36, and not finding it, or finding that it's actually on page 63. Or this book here by Erwin Gelman. I mean, he's writing a series of books about Richard Nixon, when he has a more positive view of Nixon than many other people do. But one of the things he says is that he believes that a lot of the stories that are told about Nixon and Eisenhower are people repeating stories they heard, that they're not based on primary research, and that when he goes to the archives, he can't find the primary documents to verify any of this. So there are stories about Eisenhower telling racist jokes, for example. It's very important to understand what Eisenhower's informal views on race were, to understand where he was coming from as a policymaker. And Gelman claims that he can't find this. Now, is Gelman right? It's very hard for anybody to know, because it's such a tiny group of people who've actually been in these archives. And it seems to me that there really is do you think there's a replication crisis in history, and could making the process more accessible and transparent do something about that?
Yes and yes. I mean, it's everything you just articulated. It's clear there is this, this crisis. My concern is, within what you just said, whatever is digital, accessibly, available, and it's to some extent easily accessed, we are not having the same conversation. We're not able to have the same conversation because we don't have access to the same resources. And this can continue to be, it could be an academic discussion, but as society is moving more and more and more digital, we're not going to have any readers, and I mean, popular history, especially, but they will want to see. We're not even just talking about one another being able to, I'm going to go and replicate my mentor's research. But anyone being able to then see that pattern and then go and look at that photograph. That's not what I'm seeing in this photograph. This is what I'm seeing. That's not what I'm hearing on this tape. The more that's accessible, the less we can, claim something is fake without any evidence.
I mean, another benefit of what you're talking about, you describe being bored. I mean, there's something inherently slow about archival research. It's a little bit like being out in the sands of the Kalahari looking for a bone that you're not sure is there. I mean, it's interesting to me that another biography of Nixon that was recently published, they found a memo written by H.R. Haldeman that was kind of oblique, but it appeared to substantiate that Nixon had people intervene in the peace talks in 1968 when he was running for president to avoid an October surprise, a peace treaty with Vietnam, which is something that's been alleged for, I mean, how long ago is this now? 43 years? Why are we still finding documents that are pertinent to such an important question 43 years later? It seems to me it has something to do with the accessibility of the source material.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the general, I mean, yeah, anytime I read, an article that's, archivists just discovered, just found who killed Jimmy Hoffa. Like because people are still going through boxes of paper from 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago. People are still going through paper slowly, methodically. One of the things that I find exciting about, and they're left to do it. So that's the connection between what it's going to take to get digital is a broader interest in expanding that access and an understanding of what is involved in expanding that access.
It's very. I'll tell one brief story, and then we can open the floor to questions. So I have a friend, an old friend who's an historian in Chicago, somebody I think you know, in fact, who was talking about being in the Harold Washington Library and looking up a relatively short-lived Chicago mayor, Michael Bilandic, from the 1970s, and going through these boxes and finding a wad of $100 bills. What was this money for? Who'd given it to who and why? And I mean, something like that. I mean, you just know that you're the first person to find that, right? Because if you weren't, somebody, it wouldn't be there anymore, or something would have been written about it. So the number of people who actually touch. I mean, certainly the Michael Bilandic files, but even the Richard Nixon files is surprisingly small. Mm-hmm. We have. I'd like to open the floor to student questions now. I have a few more of my own, and I'm Rachel Reynolds. Yes, very good. Has one. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, no, I'm going to exercise restraint because otherwise I have too many questions. I just really enjoyed your talk. Thanks for coming. This is just really fun to listen to. So I don't have important questions. I just have questions that I think are interesting. And the first one is about you're quick to kind of give the hashtag of Save History is the mission. I'm curious if that sometimes seems like too big of a problem for people to believe that they can have a hand in solving. And I was curious if in that vein of is this thing too blank to save? Is this piece of history too big to archive? Is it too unimportant? Is it too difficult? Is it too unorthodox to save? Is it so uncommon that nobody will need to know this again? Or is it so rare that it's the most valuable thing that we need to save? Like, are there kind of, do you experience extremes in like, how do you, what kind of bounding cases do you have in this kind of endeavor? Like, what are the out there things?
Well, I mean, it's a very fair point. I mean, most hashtags can't embrace your, I think our mission is like 48, 49 words or something, but
not a knock on the hashtag. Love the hashtag. Yeah.
No, it's absolutely fair. I just completely lost my train of thought because I went back to the hashtag. So this idea that it's too big, I mean, we hear this a lot, it's too big. And we hear this a lot. Well, let's just save what's important. Can you come in and tell us what's important? All the time. Can you come in and tell us what's important? Who am I? Who am I to judge what's important? Who am I to judge what people 50 years from now, 5 years from now, 5,000 years from now, how could I possibly know what they're going to need to know about something from my lifetime or another's lifetime that I'm going to judge important? So that's the first question. I'm not going to tell you what's important. And I sure don't think you should tell me what's important about your archive, but people will. Fine, fair enough. So where we need to prioritize, that's fine. But part of our job, I think, at HistoryIT is to kind of pull the lens back on that a bit and say, okay, well, why are we saying that this is important now? Why, and I think that there is a much greater public interest in asking those questions. What kind of, we've been doing, it's always been done. What's in our archives is something that people chose to save, right? And lots of places we go, there are organizational histories that are missing, usually from the 1950s and 60s, and usually race related. They are missing. So I can negatively judge someone else's decision to obscure the historical record. So I don't want to do it in an innocent way. Does it produce a monumental challenge? Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's also the excuse. It's the excuse that people point to all that it's so big. It's so big. You know how large my collection is? Do you know how large my collection is? Do you know how large my collection is? I don't have a budget. These are very real concerns. My board doesn't believe that archivists do anything. We haven't had an archivist for 3 years. There are all kinds of things, but at the root of them, there is this, it is too big, it is too daunting to do what you're describing. Will take so much effort, so much money, and so many people. And so it's at that point that we're saying, okay, it will, but what you're saying is, you're not saying it's impossible, you're saying it's huge. Now, what are the steps we're willing to take to that end? Is it impossible? When people say it's impossible, I see red. I just think we haven't come up with a creative solution yet. It's not free, it's not easy, but do we believe it is important? And then from there, it is about creating that plan. Okay, we can't, we did an assessment of a very large library at one point, and we came back and reported to the board, here's your strategic plan. We're going to, we do the imaging, we do the tagging, we have the software platform, HistoryIT does the whole process. We bring capacity to smaller organizations. And this is a large, well-funded library, and said, this is what you said you want. You have a very important collection. Everyone, the public agrees this is important. We all agree this is important. And it is going to take you 311 years at your current capacity to get to the digital format that you say you want to be at. And that's not even considering for future changes and iterations. So that's the only question is, are you able to accept that? Or do we start to think outside the box about other approaches?
Max Ferguson has appeared with a question. Go ahead, Max.
Hey, Dr. Kristen, thanks again for presenting today. And I got to say that your initiative is something that's near and dear to me as a first-year PhD student interested in archival research. I've dabbled in a couple of the online archives just because I've only been here during COVID. And it's extremely frustrating. The search engines result in, 99% garbage or stuff that I'm not looking for, and it turns into this square-eyed, glossed-over screen daze that I find frustrating. And then once I get on a thread of an issue, it turns to go look at this person's papers, and that's not digitized, and therefore I hit dead ends, and so I can't pursue the potential lead that I've trickled across. So. I get the budget, and, it's interesting you're talking to the LBJ school that's funded by the LBJ Association that has two purposes: to fund the school and to fund the library right next to us. And so I'd be really interested in just our local hometown library if, because I know their digitization is bad. But are there different approaches to your services? It's like, okay, look, I can digitize everything, but you've got some things on paper, and just your search engine is awful. Here's a cheap way that I could assist, I guess there's different ways to do it, because I get it, PDFs and, all these long-term floppy disk, concerns, DVDs and thumb drives and stuff that I struggle with. How do I get this old data? I don't even have a DVD player anymore, or, CD-ROM drive. So I don't know what to do about that, right? So I get it. But in the near term, just the search engines are terrible. Are there like packages or, small steps that create immediate gains that doesn't necessarily cost the big ticket dollars, but we can at least help the accessibility that you're talking about, so that way we can open up the digital archives that are being done into a more searchable, more user-friendly and cross-connected format. So that way I'm not having to like, oh, this is at the Virginia Tech Vietnam archive, this is in the Ridgway papers, this is in the Eisenhower's thing here, and JFK's got something. I just feel like I'm lost in this world of semi-digital, terribly organized, no search engine, poor quality, takes forever to download. And so it's a mess. And are there quick ways that we can at least get some progress done without having to throw big ticket items at these institutions that have no money?
No, and yes. So, because you're talking about two different things, maybe three, but you're right about this, the software system itself that could be constricting the metadata, the descriptive data that we're all searching, right? So there's that system. Can we transfer systems? Yes. Garbage in, garbage out. It's the data itself that's problematic. I mean, there is, we believe our software is superior to all of them out there, but I would never sell someone like, well, let's just migrate to our software and you'll be fine. Because if you have terrible metadata, you have terrible metadata. There's nothing I can do about that. And just in terms of transfer, there's a lot I can do. But so is it as daunting as digitizing your entire collection? No. Does it require a strategy? Yes. Does it require money? Yes. Or a heck of a lot of people. It just depends on what the circumstances are. One of the most terrifying moments of my business life was really when I had to kind of throw down this gauntlet of like, what do I truly believe? How much am I okay to say we're sticking with our mission versus like, I have people I need to pay. And it was, we had our first contract with the Baseball Hall of Fame, right? So it's a big moment for us. Feather in our cap, Baseball Hall, big client. We came in, we did our initial project with them. We had a plan to do all this other stuff. And they wanted to skip the step that you just said. And I had to say, we need to clean your catalog. Like, so we've created this strategy in all of it. The catalog cleaning up all of that metadata is necessary before we do anything else. We won't undertake any of the others without this step. That was terrifying. Like, we're going to lose this client. They got it, thankfully. So that's, you've identified an issue that is the result of Frankenstein sorts of digital collections that grow in all of these weird ways that do need to be streamlined. They do need to be cleaned. There are some things we can do to kind of much more rapidly and more efficiently. We can build tools that do certain things, but you're still looking at some degree of investment or some degree of work.
I wanted to follow up. I see Rachel has a question. I just wanted to follow up on something that something that you raised in your answer, which is, I mean, maybe you can talk about the sort of range of clients that you have, right? There are the glamorous archives, some of the ones that we talked about relating to presidential administrations or major wars, the Baseball Hall of Fame, even Chicago mayors. But there's a lot of local history as well. Can you talk about some of the clients that you have? Yeah.
History is everywhere. Yes. So I like to say, if you're older than 5 minutes and you need to be able to better tell your story, and your story relates to your history, then you're a client for us. So everything from your local historical society, or your local organization up through to these national and international institutions. we poke around in all kinds of places as how we were connected is through our work with fraternities and sororities on college campuses, which is, I say, if you had told me 10 years ago that I would spend most of my days talking about baseball and fraternities, I never would have believed you, because these were not things I knew anything about. But we're talking about rich repositories of content, really, particularly the women's organizations, because I'm a student of U.S. women's history, so it's just fascinating to me. But there are, archives exist in all these places. We think of the traditional places, we think of the professionally managed or at one time professionally managed archives, and we work with a fair number of those. But it's everywhere else too. You can't, you can't go into an organization that's older than 5 minutes and have some sense of their story without there being some sort of artifact, digital, physical, visual, it's paper, it's the first dollar bill hanging, in that mom and pop shop, whatever it is. So we've gone from California wineries to family collections. It is across the board.
Thank you. I saw Rachel's hand a minute ago, and I have the feeling that Joyce wants to ask something, but Rachel had her hand up first. Go right ahead.
It wasn't particularly noteworthy, really just a quip on the top of your answer for Max. This is one of those kind of rando off the wall. Do you think that there's a possibility that the kind of this advent of NFTs might be useful for your clients in terms of funding their digitization, projects or something like that? Like if it's Baseball Hall of Fame, I could imagine that somebody would be interested in purchasing those, whatever that digital certificate is of their whatever, historical artifact or something like that. Or same thing for these, you said there's a rich historical tradition in the fraternities and sororities. I suspect that there's just rich people who have come from those places, and as they get younger, if you will, maybe there's some monetization. Like, is there a way to kind of incentivize or help people fund these strategic plans that are, like you said, kind of creative way of monetizing their archives while still maintaining presumptively the openness to the public?
Absolutely, and that is a huge part of what we do. I didn't get into the funding plans that we create, because we're not grant writers. We're not, every organization pretty much asks us, is there a grant for this? And I have to say, no, there isn't, or there is, but it's not even going to get you close to where you want to be. So we need to think creatively about funding across the board. This is this is important, and a big part of, I think, what we do with that is thinking about organizations that are so used to raising money from people who like history. That's what they do. They fund heritage projects all the time. That's who they go to. That's I say that's 2% of our population that like history, but 100% of people like themselves. So you show them where they are in this story. That's what they're funding. They're funding their own legacy, or a legacy that they care about. That exists. So we start talking about, do you want to fund the local historical society? Well, I don't really do, I don't do history projects. But if you talk about a place, a community, you talk about something that people have deep roots in, that's a very different presentation. And that's marketing to some degree. Monetization of historical content, it just doesn't, people don't want paywalls anymore. They just don't. And even with those ones, like the baseball, where you have this massive fan base, it's still not going to be what you're looking for. So we are really talking about fundraising. And the thing about fundraising, whether from, from the Lilly Foundation or from Joe Smith, is going to be showing that we have curated content that is specific to you. So we really do focus on thinking outside the box for those fundraising options. I mean, taking advantage of what is out there in terms of funding, but for the most part, we are needing to think outside the box.
Thank you. It looks like Max has a question.
Dr. Kristen, I really liked your analogy of an intern with a scanner is like the mental model of what, a lot of different collections think is, how you digitize. To me, as a Army guy, that's the equivalent of saying a soldier with a 5-gallon can of water and a case of MREs can basically go off and do, some random tasks that clearly takes a lot more resources than that analogy. But if you told me 25 years ago that my cell phone would be able to do what it can do today, I would have just not been able to conceive what my iPhone, in terms of maps, photos, it does all these, it's a scanner in itself, talking about scanners. So is there any emerging technology, not just the style of the format that you save the file, but in terms of machine learning, AI systems that can replace the amount of people and money and time required to where an intern with a scanner, but I'm talking like not the scanner we have today, but the scanner that you envision 10 years from now, might be able to categorize, identify, and potentially sort data to a manner that we just can't conceive right now, or that you're aware of that me as a layman doesn't know is coming around the corner?
I wouldn't say around the corner. We do a lot of work and looking into AI, and it depends. And I have a lot of that same hope that we're going to continue to evolve in technology. But I'm always reluctant to talk about it, because usually it's in the frame of like, well, let's not do this until things change. There are, I'm quite passionate about how to get that amount of money that people need to spend much, much lower. At a certain point, at a certain point when you're talking about metadata, human involvement is going to be necessary. You can show me the most kick-ass AI, and there's still going to be an issue that it just isn't going to get. Currently, where we are, facial recognition, all of this, we have some degree, but if you're an archive that has millions of images that are already out there, then that facial recognition works. But if you're looking, at a fraternal a membership, of 300,000 people, and there aren't photos of them out there online, there isn't anything to grasp onto. You also get, we try to systematize as much as possible. So we try to think through that metadata. Okay, if something is tagged with this, it's also going to be tagged with these things. So that's why kind of putting that plan in place is going to reduce that. We actually, last year, we started creating hardware because software wasn't fun enough. We started creating hardware because we wanted to get around the cost for the imaging process. So we've created a product called Passport, that allows you to create those archival quality TIFFs from your iPhone in a way that they don't get compressed, and according to measured standards that would happen in our lab. So it's, there are certainly people thinking about it and where these challenges are. But there's also, like, I feel like I'm racing against, because it is so, mood lighting. It is so important that we kind of still continue to do as much as we possibly can. So we have a plan in place. It's a 20-year plan. It's a 50-year plan. It's, or we get the funding and it's a 2-year plan, whatever that looks like. We need to know that we're working toward this, because every minute that an organization isn't accessible, they are becoming more and more obsolete. We have never been so busy as we have in the last year, or the last 6 months, I'll say, because the whole world kind of got a wake-up call about how important it is to have their content digital and searchable.
That makes a lot of sense. The pandemic has changed priorities for a lot of people. When even elite historians can't get access to archives, it creates a kind of a crisis. Joyce had her hand up a moment ago. Did you have a question you still want to ask, Joyce? Go ahead.
I think Dr. Kristen just touched upon it now. I was going to talk about, or just ask you to comment on, the effects that you saw given the pandemic. We saw journal articles also moving to publicly accessible databases, and wondering if that was the case for you, but then also just piggybacking on Rachel's questions about the source of funding for you. So my interests are sort of focused on philanthropy and their role in public policy, and was curious to know You mentioned the Lilly Foundation being one of the supporters, but thinking about what, where do you see the most support from? Is it usually from government grants, or is there a role for philanthropy? I know philanthropy has played a role in sort of this field of democratizing data, but I'm not sure if that has translated to also democratizing, articles as well.
Thank you for that question. By the way, I'm going to make everyone call me Dr. Kristen now. I just think it's, I was being silly, but now I love it. Funding models, what we see, there are, the occasion, the Lilly, the, NSF, there are the places that we would traditionally think about it. By and far, they're private foundations, by and far. It's figuring out, everyone is connected to their community, whatever their community is, in a variety of ways. So it's being able to explain how, the history of the mayors in Indianapolis isn't just of interest to historians of, mid 20th century, medium-sized cities, but it's about, there's the story about this intentional creation of a sports capital. And look at all of these ways in which, isn't that fascinating to some people, some organizations? So it is being able to position it to them. And it almost always is private, unfortunately. I haven't seen, there aren't big movements to digitize in the way that I think about of what digitization is. The pandemic was definitely, it's interesting. I had a colleague in another industry say to me the other day, I'm surprised that your business is taking off because you're a luxury good. You sell a nice to have. I thought, well, wow, I've never thought of that before. And I get it. I get why he said it. And I get why to many people it is a luxury good. And I see it as a necessity. But I'm constantly thinking the role of a historian. But what this year did, as people sat around hungry for any kind of content in the phone that wasn't the content that was on the phone, our clients that we've been working with for years, they could pivot very, very quickly. There's a rich repository of content to do a programming, education, entertainment, whatever it was. They were there. They weren't kind of spinning to now try to find things. That was just in terms of delivering your content. How are you making yourself unique? How are you telling your story in a world where actually there's a moment to tell your story because everyone is online? There are way more people who are going to, look at that now than ever before. And so this we had to be prepared for a moment like this. That's changed a mindset for sure. And
sudden interest in certain topics, right? Like the Spanish flu or polio,
yes,
and the March of Dimes.
Yes.
We're at time at this point. If you have a moment, I have one last question I'd like to ask before we let you go. It's been really fascinating. We've been, you nodded, so it looks like you have time. We've been talking about this as though this is really something that that gatekeepers would really like to do, but there are some practical barriers. Is it possible in some cases that gatekeepers like to serve a certain function? I mean, I think of certain things like there's just very innocently, there's the reference librarian who's really good at their job and likes to feel important. And, in the same way that travel agents became less important when digital search tools came along. And then there's also stories like the myths, the way we think of John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln was very carefully curated after their deaths by certain insiders who wanted them to be remembered in a certain way. When you open the archives up, people whose intentions may be different get some say in what the story is that emerges.
Yes. I often say archives are where history goes to die. And I think there is gatekeeping for a variety of reasons. And one of them is perhaps an issue of fear of job security. And it's something that we address anytime we go into an archive of any sort, because once we can sit down with a reference librarian, an archivist, curator, whoever is managing that collection, that person is overworked. and still not producing enough that anyone is happy. I mean, it must be like working at the DMV, except they're passionate about what they do, and that keeps them there. So when they're passionate about what they do, again, we're not here to replace you. You know, you have knowledge of this collection, you have all of these skills that are so necessary. How would you actually like to use them? Like, where do you need that support? You know, and that honestly is what we're doing. Are there still, still gates up? Absolutely. But I think it does get us closer. And, to the nobody understands this collection the way that I do. I understand its importance. I'm going to serve really as that filter. Again, if we don't remove that layer, not in terms of that person or that role, that is not what I mean, but if we don't remove that layer in terms of access, nobody's going to come to your archive anymore. I mean, maybe not for as long as you have your job, but they're not.
Thanks so much for spending time with us. Our guest is Dr. Kristen Gwinn-Becker, who's the founder and CEO of HistoryIT.
Thank you all.